Welcome back to Silicon Wafers and another news episode. And thank you to everyone who has subscribed to the channel. It's growing rapidly, this second channel, which is focusing on short, punchy news stories. I'm very grateful to everyone who is adding comments, sharing, liking, etc. It really helps the videos to proceed in the algorithm and for new people to discover them, including adding helpful comments. Now let's jump into the story. We are under attack. Well, Wafers Daily is a roundup of news over the last 1 to 2 days with a particular focus on the resurgence of authoritarian regimes in the 21st century, great power, competition, democracy on the defensive. And today's story is a classic example of this. Russian so-called grey zone or hybrid attacks on Europe, which are escalating. The shadow war is becoming more overt. Russia's hybrid attacks on Europe are scaling up. This episode dives deep into Moscow's covert operations across the continent. Operations that are becoming implausibly deniable as the scale and scope of them increases. We'll map the sabotage, the plot, the attempted assassinations, and the creeping provocations. We'll ask why so many of these go unanswered. And how must the West change posture if it hopes to deter the hybrid war and prevent it becoming a fully kinetic one? We'll ask why so many of these go unanswered and how must the West change posture if it hopes to deter the hybrid war and prevent it becoming a fully kinetic one. We'll structure the episode in 5 parts. A historical baseline, Russia's covert hits on foreign soil pre-2022. Secondly, we'll look at the surge in attacks since February 2022, sabotage, subversion, and assassination attempts. 3, what's new in September 2025, recent grey zone provocations, and why the West is slow to respond, and what critics call the weak deterrence response of the West. And finally, the Hawks prescription, what we should be doing now. Let's start with the old playbook, an historical baseline, Russia's covert operations in Europe pre-2022. To understand Russia's hybrid escalation today, we need to remember that covert action on foreign soil is not new to the Kremlin. In the early 2000s and 2010s, Russia was implicated in poisoning and assassination attempts against defectors and dissidents in the UK and Europe. For example, the 2006 poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London, the 2018 Skripal poisonings in Salisbury, and multiple other attacks on Russian émigrés. These were audacious, attention-grabbing misdeeds, often conducted in broad daylight or with flagrant boldness. Their public exposure forced diplomatic blowback, expulsions, and reputational costs, but never any decisive military or economic retaliation. Nothing that would deter Russia from continuing these attacks, at least. Contrast this with today's hybrid war. The older model was targeted, high profile, and personal, targeting individuals and making examples of them, sending signals to everybody else, at least to a Russian audience. The contemporary model is collective, distributed, deniable, and dispersed. For instance, bombs in warehouses, sabotage of infrastructure, cyber attacks, drones, proxies, outsourcing terror operations, and provocations. The hybrid surge since February 2022, sabotage, subversion, and assassination plots. Well, since Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, Europe has seen a significant escalation of covert hostile acts attributed to or strongly suspected of being orchestrated by Russian intelligence and military agencies, often with plausible deniability, though latterly that is becoming far less plausible as the scale and scope of these operations increases. As the CSIS, Russia's shadow war against the West database shows, Russia is conducting an escalating and violent campaign of sabotage and subversion against European and US targets in Europe. The number of Russian attacks nearly tripled between 2023 and 2024, according to CSIS. A summary from Russian hybrid warfare in Europe 2022 to the present notes that sabotage, cyber attacks, assassinations, vandalism, undersea cable tampering, information warfare, and more have become staples in the Kremlin's toolkit. The Atlantic Council has documented that Russia's hybrid campaign doesn't just include digital attacks, but also physical sabotage, infiltration, coercion, and disinformation. So here are some selected incidents with plots attached and extra context. In Germany, in 2024, a plot to sabotage US military bases and infrastructure was exposed. That's from International Relations. In 2024, US and German intelligence reportedly foiled an attempt to assassinate Armin Papaga, CEO of Rheinmetall, a major arms supplier to Ukraine and indeed to the German army. That's from uacrisis.org. There have been numerous arson attacks, for instance, a fire at an IKEA store in Vilnius, a shopping centre fire in Warsaw, incendiary packages sent via DHL hubs, multiple episodes of sabotage attributed to proxy networks supporting Russia's hybrid war. We've also seen the probing of undersea infrastructure. The Russian research and surveillance ship Yantar has been reported loitering near European submarine cables, potentially for espionage or sabotage. That's covered by the Financial Times. And here's an incident which perhaps not everyone has heard of. The Bremanger Dam sabotage in Norway, April 2025. Hackers opened floodgates remotely, discharging water for hours before their detection. Whilst no casualties occurred, officials suspected pro-Russian cybercriminal groups. The aim of this type of operation is to influence and to cause fear and chaos amongst the general population. It was quoted at the time. That is from Wikipedia. And of course, we've all been following the recent airspace drone incursions. On the 9th to 10th of September 2025, an incursion of 19 to 23 drones entered eastern Poland from alleged Russian launch sites, triggering NATO defences and prompting Poland to invoke Article 4. Since then, we've seen MiGs violating Estonian airspace, which also prompted them to invoke Article 4 of the NATO treaty. These actions are calibrated to test responses, stay below kinetic thresholds, and exploit Western hesitancy. The tactics are layered: cyber, physical, sabotage, drones, infiltration, and disinformation. Russia uses proxies, often paid operatives, and recruits sympathizers to maintain a veneer of deniability. See an episode we ran last year about how Russia is outsourcing its spying and terror operations. The increase in frequency suggests this is not battlefield noise, but is a deliberate campaign to stretch Europe's security metrics, test its will and capability. You'll know from recent episodes that it's my belief that this will escalate further and dramatically. We have seen incursions into Denmark in the last couple of days. We've seen airports shut down. Expect this to increase in scale, scope, and frequency. What's new in September 2025? Fresh provocations and escalation. Well, recent attacks and trends can be noted. The drone incursion into Poland is one. It marks a bold escalation. Drones flying over NATO member territory from Russia, not just adjacent territories. European airspace violations. Russian drones and warplanes have repeatedly tested boundaries in Poland, the Baltic states, and the Nordics. Increased focus on undersea cable surveillance via Yantar as a tool for espionage or future sabotage. Let's not forget, these are all testing and probing exercises. We have to ask the question, testing for what? Creating foundations for what scale of future attacks? European Union's diplomatic position. Via Kaja Kallas, an EU diplomat, she recently denounced Russia's persistent hybrid campaigns, listing sabotage, critical infrastructure attacks, informational interference, and physical attacks. That's listed in the Atlantic Council. We're not even talking here about the electoral interference that we've seen in Romania, Moldova, and other territories. That's another topic, but of course it is in some ways linked to Russia's grey zone operations. These provocations test NATO's rules of engagement and test their political will as well. And there are lesser-known attacks with big implications. Lithuania, the Vilnius IKEA arson of 2024, a fire deliberately set at a major IKEA store was linked to a Russia-connected sabotage network. Lithuanian security services suggested it was meant to test emergency response and cause economic disruption, not a mass casualty event. Then there was the fire in one of Warsaw's largest shopping malls, 2024. A suspicious fire broke out at the Marywilska shopping centre. Investigations pointed to arson with ties to Russian proxy operatives. Again, the goal was disruption and fear, not open war. Then there's the parcel bomb campaign of 2022 to 23. Spanish police investigated letter bombs sent to the Ukrainian embassy in Madrid, the US embassy, and Spanish defense firms. Authorities later tied them to Russian military intelligence networks using proxies. Bulgaria, an ammo dump explosions 2022 to 24. Multiple ammunition warehouses and arms factories supplying Ukraine suffered mysterious fires and blasts. Bulgarian prosecutors reopened probes into Russian GRU involvement, echoing earlier Czech Republic 2014 depot explosions. Germany, rail sabotage, October 22. Coordinated fibre optic cable cuts disrupted rail traffic across northern Germany. Officials later said the sophistication suggested state involvement. Suspicion fell on Russian actors testing critical infrastructure vulnerability. Norway, GPS jamming 22 to 25. Northern Norway and Finland repeatedly reported GPS interference traced to sources inside Russia's Kola Peninsula. This undermines aviation safety and shipping navigation, classic grey zone harassment that falls just short of open warfare. France, Bordeaux, cyber attacks 23. A ransomware attack hit Bordeaux city administration. Investigators linked the infrastructure to Russian-aligned criminal groups working with state tolerance, blurring the lines between cybercrime and state sabotage. Netherlands, undersea infrastructure reconnaissance 2023. Dutch intelligence exposed a Russian vessel mapping offshore wind farms and data cables in the North Sea. Officials called it preparatory reconnaissance for future sabotage. Now, none of these incidents made NATO invoke Article 5 or even 4. Most didn't even spark sanctions. Yet each targeted a piece of Europe's critical fabric: transport, energy, logistics, civilian morale. Are we really trying to imagine what might happen if Russia brings all these together in a simultaneous attack at scale? I'm not sure we're really facing the consequences of that yet, but we may soon have to. So why has the West downplayed these attacks and avoided strong retaliation? Well, there are a number of hypotheses. Attribution, difficulty, and deniability. Many acts are hard to link conclusively to Moscow. Russia uses proxies, shell companies, and clandestine networks, as well as crypto, to cloak the chain of command, who's commissioned and who pays for these operations. There is, of course, as well, an escalation risk. Any overt retaliation risks spiraling the conflict, especially when attacks blur the line between war and peace, which is exactly what Russia is doing. There are, of course, in the West, legal and political norms. Western democracies often default to judicial, diplomatic, or sanction responses rather than kinetic retaliation. Because of legal constraints, because of command chains, public opinion, and institutional inertia. There is as well, especially amongst NATO, a fear of overcommitment, especially with the US withdrawing to an extent from its policeman role on the European continent. There's concern that responding too strongly might pull NATO deeper into a direct war with Russia or provoke unwanted escalation. And lastly here, there is cognitive dissonance, unreadiness. Some Western leaders treat these operations as aberrations or nuisances rather than integral to Russia's war doctrine. Well, here are some quotes from the more hawkish commentators. For hawkish, let's read usually right, correct, or more realistic. Many analysts argue that this pattern of timid responses conveys weakness, further encouraging Moscow's probing. They insist that deterrence must not only target missiles and tanks, but also subversion, sabotage, and covert attacks. Some propose more aggressive attribution, public naming of the hostile actors, seizure of adversary assets, covert countermeasures, and retaliatory sabotage. As my guest on Silicon Curtain today suggests, that's Edward Lucas, our responses are always predictable, no matter how strong we think they are. We are always reactive. This allows Moscow to maintain escalation dominance and gives them the impression that limits have not been reached and that they can probe further and test. There are, of course, some historical parallels prior to the 2000s versus today. And of course, if we go back to the Cold War period, in earlier decades, attacks on dissidents or covert hits would provoke diplomatic crises, expulsions, and even sanctions, but they were relatively few and isolated. Today's hybrid incidents are systemic, persistent, and geographically dispersed. Also, the level of aggression behind them is on a different scale. The costs and implications are also far higher, but the Western model of response is slower and more cautious than it was before during the Cold War. What the hawks say, how to determine Russia now, what should we be doing? Well, one, make deterrence multi-domain. Deterrence cannot be just about bombs and tanks. It must visibly include retaliation in the cyber, sabotage, and covert domains. Public attribution and retaliation produce a cost signal that Russia cannot easily ignore. It suggests that we're not imposing the costs on Russia at the moment, or costs at least that they find prohibitive, and we're not giving them signals that they should cease and desist. Two, preemptive counter-sabotage. Use the same hybrid toolkit, infiltration, disruption of Russian proxy network, supply chain denial, targeted takedown of GRU cells before they act. In a word, act more like we did against Russian spy networks during the Cold War period. Develop active defense, not only guarding, but contesting space, which Russia is trying to infiltrate. Three, shield vulnerable infrastructure. We must, with a sense of urgency, harden undersea cables, logistics nodes, power grids, transport systems. We must invest in resilience, redundancies, and rapid repair capabilities. We must learn from Ukraine, who's had to develop all of these responses in wartime. Number four, sanctions with teeth and symmetry, or asymmetry, which we're going to come to. Move from freezing assets to possible appropriation for reconstruction or compensation, but especially use frozen Russian assets to help arm Ukraine. We must sanction proxy operators, enablers, laundering facilities, not just the big oligarchs. Edward Lucas, again my guest today, suggests asymmetric responses that deliver three benefits: real costs for the Kremlin that show a clear punitive response. Our response in that case would be unpredictable and may give the Kremlin some pause to reconsider their next escalatory step. And finally, we keep these responses below a fully confrontational kinetic response. For instance, each drone incursion would elicit a response from the West that we would hand over another $1 billion of frozen Russian assets, central bank assets, to Ukraine to help it fight back. Number five, intelligence escalation and allied coordination. We must share real-time tactical intel among NATO, EU, UK, and Ukraine to root out sabotage networks and use a joint task force to disrupt cross-border operations. Six, we must signal credible thresholds, establish that any sabotage or drone strikes cross certain lines, for instance, anything on NATO soil. This will trigger a defined, proportionate military or covert response to protect our territory. The line must be clear. For Russia, ambiguity is a weapon in its arsenal. And here's what a few commentators are saying and experts on In Moscow's Shadows. Mark Galeotti often emphasizes that the Kremlin uses persistent pressure, not grand gestures, to wear down the West, and that only persistent counter-pressure can impose real costs on Moscow. On Russian roulette, analysts warn that a war fought partially in the dark demands a darker toolkit in response, and Vladimir Milov and other Russian dissident analysts argue that the regime in Russia believes the West will back down before it escalates. That assumption, that cycle of assumption, must be broken. We must not be passive spectators in a long shadow fight. When a dam is hacked, when a cable is severed, when a warehouse burns, not only in Ukraine but in Germany, Denmark, Sweden, we are all on the front line. Russia is testing the limits of our tolerance. We must not surrender them and must not signal weakness or predictability, because these simply provoke the next attack by Russia.